So we'll be doing two parts of chapter 21 because there are two distinct stories in them. All right. So the Lord bless the reading of his word. Genesis 21:1. Vadonai pakad et Sarah ka'asher amar. Vaya'as Adonai l'Sarah ka'asher diber. Vatahar vatelid Sarah la'Avraham ben lizkunav. La moed asher diber oto Elohim. Verse 3. Vayikra Avraham et Shem beno hanolad lo asher yalada lo Sarah Yitzchak. Verse 4. Vayamol Avraham et Yitzchak beno ben Shimonat Yamim Ka'asher tziva oto Elohim. Verse 5. Va'avraham ben Ma'at Shana Behivalid lo et Yitzchak beno. Okay, we'll stop there and translate. It's going back to verse 1. The Lord visited Sarah just as he had said. And Yahweh did for Sarah just as he said. I have a bit of parallelism there. And she became pregnant, and Sarah became pregnant and gave birth for Avraham, or bore a son in his old age. Usually we would translate this last part here, Liz Kunav. At the appointed time which God had spoken. And Avraham, this is verse 3, and Avraham called the name of his son, so just named his son, the one who was born for him, whom Sarah bore for him, Isaac. In verse 4, and Avraham circumcised Isaac, his son, this is when he was 8 days old, a son of 8 days, just as God had commanded him. And Avraham was 100 years old when he was born. There's a kind of a grammatical issue here, but in his being born, in the birth, let's say, of Isaac, his son. Okay, verse 6. Vatomer Sarah Sechok asali Elohim kol hashomeya Yitzchak li. Vatomer mi milel la Avraham heinika vanim Sarah ki yaladti vein liz kunav. Verse 8. Vayigdal hayeled vayigamal vaya'as Avraham mishteh gadol b'yom higamel et Yitzchak. Verse 9. Vatere Sarah et ben Hagar hamitzrit asher yalada la Avraham mitzakek. Vatomer la Avraham garesh ha'ama hazot ve'et bana ki lo yirash ben ha'ama hazot im beni im Yitzchak. Okay, we're stop there, go back to verse 6 and translate. And Sarah said, laughter he's done for me, or laughing he's made for me, the God has made for me. Everyone who hears will laugh for me. And she said, who has said to Avraham, Sarah will give suck to sons? I bet there's no English translation that has that phrase, but will nurse sons. For I have given birth, or I have borne a son in his old age. Verse 8, and the child grew and was weaned by Yigamal, and Avraham prepared a great feast in the day of being weaned of Isaac, the day that when Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw, or maybe now, Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom who gave birth for Avraham, and then playing. And there's a textual issue here, a possible text critical issue, if I'll come back to it. But for now, just saw him playing. And she said to Avraham, send away this maidservant and her son, for he shall not inherit, or the son of this maidservant shall not inherit with my son, with Isaac. And the matter troubled, the matter was very troubling in the eyes of Avraham on account of his son. Verse 12, oh, I didn't read this part. Let me go back, starting back in the reading, verse 11. Vayera hadavar ma'od be'enei Avraham, al odot bano. Verse 12, Vayomer Elohim El Avraham, al yera be'enecha al hana'ar ba'al amatecha kol asher Omar elecha Sarah, Shema bekola, ki veyitzchak yikare lecha zara. Verse 13, Vagam et ben ha'ama logoy asimenu ki zarecha hu. Okay, now I'm going to translate verse 11. And it was the matter was very troubling in the eyes of Avraham on account of his son. And God said to Avraham, do not be troubled, or let it not be troubling in your eyes about the boy. God uses a different word for Ishmael, the boy, and about your maidservant. Everything that she says, or she will say to you, Sarah, listen to her, listen to her voice. For in Isaac, a seed will be called for you. And then verse 13, and also the son of the maidservant, I will make him into a great nation, for he is your seed. Verse 14, Vayash came Avraham baboker, Vayekach lechem, Vachemat mayim, Vayetain el Hagar sam al shikma, Ve'et hayelid, Vayishalecheha, Vatelech Vateta Bamidbar Ba'er Shava. Verse 15, Vayichelu hamayim min hachemet, Vatash lecha et hayelid tachat achad hasichim. Verse 16, Vatelech vateshiv la minegid harchek, Then Kim Tachave Kashet or Keshet. Ki Amara Al Ere Bamot Hayalid. Vateshiv Meneged Vatisa et Kola Vatevk. Okay, going back to verse 14 to translate. Avraham rose early in the morning, and he took bread and a chemat of mayim. Chemat is a water skin. It's only used in this passage, of course, 3 times, and only in Genesis 21. Anyway, he took a water skin of water, and he gave it to Hagar, placing it upon her shoulder, and the child, and he sent her away. And she went, and she wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And they finished off the water from the water skin. And she threw the child, or maybe set, but it's the word kind of cast, set the child under one of the bushes. In verse 16, and she went and she dwelled by herself, or sat by herself, on the opposite side, far away, about a bow shot away. For she said, may I not see or look upon the death of the boy, or the child. And she sat opposite, and she lifted her voice, and she wept. Okay, verse 17. Vayishma Elohim et kol hana'ar, vayikra malach Elohim el Hagar, Hagar, min hashemayim, vayomer la, malach Hagar, al tiri ki shama Elohim el kol hana'ar, ba'asher hu sham. Verse 18, kumi si'i et hana'ar, v'hachziki et yadech bo, ki logoi gadol asimenu. Verse 19, vayif kach Elohim et eineha, vatere be'er mayim, vatelech vatimale et hachemet mayim, vatashk et hana'ar. Verse 20, vayehi Elohim et hana'ar vayigdal, vayeshiv bamidbar, vayehi roveh kashet, vayeshiv bamidbar paran, vatekach lo imo isha me'erev Mitzrayim. Okay, that's the end of this story. I'll go back, translate now. Verse 17. God heard the voice of the young boy, or the boy, and a messenger of God called to Hagar from the heavens. And he said to her, what is it to you, Hagar? And this is a kind of a common phrase, usually kind of what's wrong with you, or sometimes what's with you. Basically, what's going on, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard or listened to the voice of the boy where he is, as in the place where he is. Get up, lift up the boy, take hold seize with your hand him. So take hold of him with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Verse 19. And God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and she filled the water skin of water and she gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up, and this is kind of the conclusion, and he dwelled in the wilderness, and he was skilled with the bow, or he was great with the bow. And he dwelled in the wilderness of Paran. And she took for him, or his mother took for him, a wife from the land of Egypt. The end. Okay. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, Chad Yaakov from Mozambique. I gotta just acknowledge that real quick. Glad that you're here. So we're going to read the second half of chapter 21, but let's take some time to talk about this riveting story, probably the more riveting of the two stories in chapter 21. What questions or observations do you have about the Hagar story? We read the first Hagar story where she went into the wilderness once Sarah found out that she was pregnant. Right, and then you have kind of this prophetic word, but then in that story she's sent back. Here now she is sent out again, but not with a child.
I was wondering about I can't remember which verse it was, but I wrote a note about whenever it was the day Isaac was weaned, they had a feast.
Yeah.
And as I was listening to that, I was like, surely there's not like it was today he was weaned. Is in the day more of a saying of like during the season, during that time kind of a thing, or is it specifically like today is the December 1st kind of a thing?
Yeah, I mean, that depends on I would say on the style of the story more than the grammar. But Yom certainly can mean on the day of his being weaned. Like, so part of the way to answer that in this particular story is that traditionally, according to some other biblical texts, we think that children were weaned around 3 years old in ancient Israel. So we might imagine Isaac being a 3-year-old in this story, or at least in that account. I mean, I'm sure it's around the day. It may not have been like on his 3-year-old birthday, they cut him off. We don't, have enough to say that, but yeah, I would say just it's probably more general, not concerned with the detail. Now, if this is some narrators, some storytellers, even in the Pentateuch, some voices are really into details and days, but this story doesn't seem to be too caught up on it.
Yeah, it doesn't seem really critical as far as it
Right.
Wouldn't really change the story. I was just curious.
Yeah.
And I had a beginner, like, I don't understand Hebrew yet question.
Yeah. Good.
From verse 5,
Mhm.
there was a word, and I'm probably going to mispronounce it terribly. About midway through, it's Bahi.
Yeah.
Leda.
Yes.
Led, maybe. Anyway.
Hivalid.
Yeah, the Hawley. My question specifically is about if I don't know. I've heard so many different people say Vav or Wow or however you pronounce
Vav.
that.
Yeah.
How do you know when it's a V sound? Because sometimes it almost makes a Y, sometimes it's an O, and all these different things. And I'm like, in my reading and study within the grammar book I have, it doesn't seem to be very clear to me how to know what sound does it make.
Yeah, good. I'm glad for these types of questions. So keep them coming. If you look at that word, it does have a dogish, right? But it also has another vowel. So when it's a shurik, when it's an oo sound, just a straight up long vowel, then it won't have another vowel with it. But so since this one has comets underneath it, then it's a v, so it's va in this case, and it's a vav then is a consonant.
So it depends on if there's a vowel underneath it, not just the placement of the, I'm just going to call it a dot, because it can be up to the top left, next to it, and kind of at the bottom, right?
Yeah, I mean, Yavav can have a holum over it and be an O sound.
Right.
It can have a dagish in the middle, where it's not dagish, but it's that dot that's with the shurik and be an U sound.
Right.
But anytime it's consonantal, I pronounce it as V, a Vav sound. Some traditions have that as a W sound. But when it's consonantal, the way to know the difference between a vowel and a consonant is whether it has another vowel. If it has two vowel looking things, it only has one vowel. Like in this case, it only has comets.
Yeah.
The dot is not a vowel. But if that comets wasn't there, we would want to say this somehow as ooh.
Right. Okay. Because the example that I remember hearing was like Dod, Dude, and David are like all spelled the same, but it matters where the dot is.
Good. Yeah,
and I was like, that doesn't help.
Right.
Anyway.
If it's a dot underneath, like in that case, David as the hirik underneath, then the vav. Vav will only be a vowel when it's with the shurik or the holum.
Okay.
Good. Yeah, grammatical questions are welcome, and other types of questions.
In verse 6, we have the naming of Isaac, and so like it says like so we have Vatomer Sarah Sohek or Sahok. So that's like that's laughter, right? Or I'm just wondering, like, what is the exact meaning of Sahok? So how do you say that?
Sahok.
And then grammatically, Yitzhak.
Yes.
Does that mean like how is that parsed out? Like, is that a future?
It's it. Yeah. Imperfect third person masculine singular. He will laugh. Like in this phrase, at least. So if you, there's all sorts of word plays with Isaac's name here. And we've been having them earlier too. We've had lots of, this is coming off of, especially of chapters 17 and 18. In 17, where Avraham laughs when God tells him about a child. And then 18, when Sarah laughs when she overhears, through the tent. And here, you have her own interpretation of why he's named Isaac, where, Sarah said, he has made laughter for me. That's the way I would try. So it's just a noun. Sachok, laughter. God has made laughter for me. And then she says, all who hear, so everyone who hears will laugh for me. I would say this is a joyous kind of celebration type of laughter, but Yitzchak is the verbal form. And then we don't really have.
Is that singular or plural?
It's singular. So kol is singular. So that's like the word in English, every is singular, all is plural. Kol shomea is a singular participle. So every person who laughs, or everyone who hears, will laugh for me. So it's singular, third person, masculine, singular. And then his actual name, where did we get that? Is down in verse 8. So in the narrative, right? So the child grew up, he was weaned. Avraham prepared a great feast on that day. We talked about that. The day of his weaning of Isaac. So his name has the comets instead of, like, if you compare that with the verb that has the patak, it's a bit of a differentiation, but it basically looks like he will laugh, or he laughs, the verb. And then in verse 9, we get this really interesting verb, or it was a participle, it's a PL participle of the same root. So it's the last word and it's the main verb. So Sarah saw Ishmael, which who is not named in this story. So just he's called lots of different things. We could talk about that. Mitzachik, playing. So we've had this PL participle of mitzachik back when, no, we will have it. I guess we know the rest of the story, but we will have it again with Isaac and Rebecca when they get caught being husband and wife by Abimelech, I think, or where it's clearly something more than just a child's play, right? In this story, it's really ambiguous, and I don't know if you want to follow me down this rabbit hole here, but there's a text critical thing where the Greek adds with Isaac, her son. So he was playing with Isaac, her son. And most English translations will think that that's probably something that just got left out of the Hebrew, but it should be there. And there's a whole history here of interpretation. In Galatians, it picks this up and being a really negative, like he's making fun of, taunting Isaac. So he's kind of he's being abusive to Isaac in some way. The Hebrew story, I think, doesn't infer that or imply that. Seems to me that Sarah is, in her own interpretation, she's mostly concerned about inheritance, not how Isaac is being treated by Ishmael, but rather who will be the one to inherit Abraham's wealth. And so this is the main motivation for her. So she looks, which throughout the Genesis stories, seeing, looking, and then taking is usually the next action of somebody's kind of downfall. In this story, it's looking and then sending away. So there's quite a tradition, anyway, with this mitzacheking at the end of verse 9.
So something that stood out to me was, I guess, it's verse 17.
Mm-hmm.
It's, what was it? Vayishma Elohim et kol hana'ar. It's like he listened to the voice of the boy.
Yeah.
Last time they were in the wilderness, he heard and saw Hagar, but this time he hears the voice of the boy, not Hagar, the boy.
Yeah.
Which I think is interesting that it points that out instead of listening or seeing Hagar again. It's like I'm looking at this boy. Right.
And the previous verse, it's Hagar who's actually, lifting her voice and crying. So yeah, but the child is sort of in this story anyway. I mean, no doubt God is caring for Hagar by caring for the child, but the child is really the main focus of concern. And I mentioned earlier too that if you just trace to this narrative, the names, Ishmael is not named, but the way that he's identified by different characters is really fascinating. Like for Sarah, he is the child of the maidservant, the son of the maidservant. We have for Avraham, however, he's troubled because of his son, right? So there's this, it's the narrator recognizing in the eyes of Avraham, Ishmael is not just the child of the maidservant, it's one of his sons, it's his seed. Then we have Yeled and Na'ar used. So Na'ar is usually, you might think of a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old. Just generally like a boy. where a Yelet is usually a younger child. And there's some ambiguity. I think one of the more confusing things about this story is, I mean, he's a small child. Earlier in the narrative, Ishmael was like a teenager in chapter 17. And, so there's something, saying something about Genesis here. I mean, he's clearly not a teenager here. He places the child in his mother's arms. Hagar is instructed to pick him up, it's hard to imagine a teenager huddling under a bush crying, being left, just staying put. It's a child, and he's a younger child in this story. So it says something about the nature of Genesis. It's a collection of stories that have been put in generally a chronological order, but not always in a purely chronological order.
That's like, I'm immediately going, well, that's confusing, right?
Yeah.
As you think about the idea of he's making fun of or playing with, however you phrase that, or laughing at. I think I've even heard in the English ones, but he's making fun of Isaac, and like you said, I feel like I remember him being rendered as like 13 or something like this whenever Isaac was born.
Yes.
And so there's like what you said, a teenager, right? So there's a little bit of confusion there with how can he now be a boy that could be carried? Right.
That's why I said this is something I think is the most confusing thing of the story. Like, how old are we supposed to imagine? I mean, everything in the story makes us, I think, imagine a relatively young child. I mean, I guess older than Isaac, but just the helplessness of the boy, and I mean, I think, I'm sure some have tried to make sense of this with Isaac being a teenager, but Hagar is a really strong woman then. If he's like, and Avraham is placing him in Hagar's arms, and then she's throwing him down under a bush, and he's staying there to die. It just, it doesn't quite make sense with a teenager. Letty?
Back to this question of when were they considered children? I mean, are we to assume that the bar mitzvah is that what marks it, and then when they paid the temple tax? So are we talking like 12, 20? Are those marks?
They are, but I wouldn't say that. I think it would be anachronistic to put any of that kind of on these stories. In other words, like especially in the patriarchal times, we don't have those ceremonies necessarily. Like I don't know when, if you ask a contemporary Jew, when they would say the origins of the bar mitzvah ceremony would have started. You mean you have circumcision on the 8th day in these stories, and you have a feast, at least in this one case when Isaac is weaned, but we really don't have any indications of other temporal markers of kind of growing up into age. It'd be fascinating to know that. Maybe y'all can think of something in the Hebrew text when sort of a coming of age story. I think we have that a bit maybe in the Jacob and Esau stories, when the blessing is being given by the father, and like Esau is going out and hunting, Jacob's cooking up some stuff, when he's deceived and all of that. There is a blessing that's passed on, but that seems to be basically Isaac is on his deathbed. So not at a particular age for the child.
Is there anything about, like, I'm thinking of Samuel. I know there's a very similar passage of he grew in wisdom and stature, basically, and in favor with God and man, similar to Luke 2:52. But is that sort of a coming of age kind of a story like you're talking about?
I mean, he stays with Hannah until he's weaned, right? And then he goes lives with Samuel. So there is this kind of staying with the mom until he's off of breast milk, and then he's sort of like of age to leave the house. And then you do have these narrative phrases of, even here, he grew up, he became Gadol. So there, and that kind of usually the narrator is kind of speeding things along, and he became old and he grew up in the wilderness. But yeah, that's another story where you definitely have kind of coming of age. See, Marisa?
Talking about the idea of child versus boy or lad, if anyone sees different from this, let me know. But where he is called a child, it looks like it's only in verses 14 to 16. And it's always when he's paired with his mother. So to me, it comes across as the mother looking at, this is my child. Doesn't matter whether he's 16, whether he's 50, he's my child.
Yeah.
And she wants to care for him and protect him. But in the other passages where it's God or it's Abraham or it's Sarah, he's a boy. He's a boy.
Yeah.
But for Hagar, he's my child.
Yeah, for sure. So it's kind of like there's kind of three different perspectives on the child. Hagar's is unique. And then the majority male perspective is the Na'ar. Except for the one case where Avraham care is troubled because it's his son. And then you have Sarah's kind of really distancing the son of the maidservant. I'm still seeing the relationship to the mom. So that's a good observation. And what I picked up this morning as I was thinking through this, there's a book, it's by Bar Efrat, Narrative Art in the Bible. And he has a little thing on this. We've already said what his point is, but he just kind of goes through and looks at, thinking about characterization and how the narrative uses particular words with different characters. I see an article that's posted by Daniel. I am not looking at it, but I assume it will tell us about the history of Bar Mitzvah. So take a look at that. Man reached it. Go ahead.
I had a question about in verse 13. I think so. How you translate it as a maidservant or something like that?
Ama.
Ama lagoi. Is that like a? Yeah. Can you just explain that a little?
Yeah. So verse 13, Vagam et ben ha'ama, the son of the maidservant. Big comma
So
there.
ama is maidservant?
Yeah. Or handmaiden, or female servant.
And then lagoi?
Lagoi goes with what comes next. Lagoi asimenu, I will seem, place, and I think I translated that as make him into a nation.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, so the goy doesn't go with ha'ama.
Okay, yeah, because that was throwing me. Okay.
Yeah, good question.
Okay. But mother is, what's the word for mother?
Aim.
And so then ima is.
Yeah, it's a matter of vowel pointing, and this one has the hey.
Okay.
But
Right.
Like Amy is my mother, but it's just the aleph, and it is aleph and mem there.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. This one more thing came to my mind about growing of age in Ezekiel. This is not really, he's a man from the beginning of Ezekiel, but it begins in the 30th day, and it seems like it's talking about his birthday. And that probably relates to a tradition that comes out of Numbers, that somebody could enter into a priest could enter into temple service when they became 30 and older. So their 30th birthday would be a mark when a priest would take up this particular work within the temple. That's really doesn't relate to moving out of childhood, but it is an age that's associated with a new opportunity, like kind of like 16 and 21 in American cultures. And I'm sure there are others.
On verse 8, on the art scroll commentary, it has a lot in there, but it does say that there's one Rabbi Bakia. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his name. Says I'm not. So it says according to that rabbi, Abraham made this great feast when Isaac began to study the Torah. Obviously, that wouldn't be a written Torah, but it is. It seems to be along the line of marking this transition.
Yeah, well, and that would definitely relate to the bar mitzvah, right? Because that's what bar mitzvah is about, the son of the commandment, right? Where you there's this oral reading of the Torah in the bar mitzvah ceremony. So, I mean, an earlier origin. And for the rabbis, they want to relate even the patriarchs back to times of Torah, right? So that everything is going to be about studying Torah. Yeah,
there apparently are other rabbis that it talks about that point this back to circumcision, but that's that might be a bit early, but I thought that was interesting.
You mean after you're circumcised, you start studying Torah?
Perhaps it's early. No. The feast in verse 8.
Right. Yeah.
So there's a dispute. There's a dispute. Is it after the circumcision, or is it beginning to study Torah?
Oh, okay. I got you. Okay. Yeah.
I just wondered too if that feast has something to do with, like, maybe that was something in the ancient times to like when you have high mortality rates for children, you could see that weaning a child would be a momentous occasion.
Yes, for sure. I mean, definitely that's a helpful cultural insight, where it's like the child has life. They're celebrating the successful few years of moving out of the infant stage to a more sustainable stage. Yeah, especially, I mean, thinking about, I mean, even not with Isaac's case, it doesn't come up as an issue, but with Ishmael's case, if we compare what we're talking about with this feast and weaning and so on with this other child who's, just desperate for water, right? And he's thirsty. I mean, there's kind of a kind of comparison about, will the seed or the children of Abraham continue to live on? And God is going to kind of see both through. There's more to talk about here. I do want to read the last part. I don't think there's as much to talk about with the well deal, but I still want to read it. Maybe one thing that I keep on thinking about whenever I read like the Hagar story and Sarah, especially when I read about Sarah, like how am I? There's a kind of parallel here in some of the other patriarchal narratives of these kind of lead women being advocating for their children against the other children, right? It's not a surprising dynamic, perhaps, but we have this with Rebecca, with Jacob rather than Esau. We'll have it with Rachel and Leah, and whose children, who's going to kind of have like their competition. So on the one hand, I really don't care for Sarah much in this story. I don't think the Bible is trying to side with her. But God does say, listen to her voice, and telling Abraham, and Abraham is troubled by it, right? Rightly so. But God says, hey, I'm going to take care of her. So, and this is kind of what happens in the last story too. It's just, these stories, I think, are here to wrestle with. They're very human. And yet kind of God persevering, God's purposes, maybe even in spite of human flaws, maybe even because of human flaws. I think that's a big part of reading these Genesis narratives. Okay, let's read the last part here. So beginning in verse 22. Vayihi ba'et hahi vayomer Avimelech ufichol sar tzva'o el Avraham lemor Elohim imcha b'chol asher ata oseh. Verse 23. Va'ata hishava'a li, hishava'a li belohim heina im tishkor li ulanini ulanechdi kachesed asher asiti imcha ta'aseh imadi ve'im haaretz asher garta ba. Verse 24. Vayomer Avraham anochi ishabea. Verse 25. Vahochiach Avraham et Avimelech al odot be'er hamayim asher gazalu avdei Avimelech. Vayomer Avimelech lo yadati mi ya'asa et hadavar hazeh. V'gam ata lo higadta li. V'gam anochi lo shamati bilti hayom. Verse 27. Vayakach Avraham son uvakar vayetain la Avimelech. Vayichretu Shinehem Berit. Okay, we're going to read this in two parts. That's part one. So going back to translate. And it came about in that time, Avimelech said, and Pichol is a proper name. Pichol, the captain of his army, said to Avraham, saying, God be with you, or God is with you in all that you are doing. And now swear to me, the Nifal imperative of Shavah, swear to me by God here, if you will deceive me. This is an oath formula, so I'll do it literally plainly and then make it better. If you will deceive me or my descendants or my progeny, oath formulas have gapping. I can come back to this, but usually it will be translated, you must not, do not deceive me. Swear to me that you will not deceive me or my descendants or my progeny, because, not because, according to chesed, according to kindness, which I have done with you, you will do with me, and with the land where you are sojourning. Okay, verse 24. And Avraham said, I swear. And Avraham rebuked Avimelech, or contested with Avimelech, on account of the well of water, which the servants of Avimelech had seized. Gazalu. We looked away. There we go. Verse 26. And Avimelech said, I didn't know who did this thing. And also you did not declare to me, or you yourself haven't declared to me, and I haven't heard until now, or until today, Hayom. And verse 27, and Avraham took sheep and cattle, and he gave them to Avimelech, and they cut a covenant, the two of them. Okay, reading the rest of it, starting verse 28. Vayatsev Avraham et Sheva kivsot hatzon levadehen. Verse 29, Vayomer Avimelech el Avraham, Mahena Sheva Kavasot Ha'ele, Asher Hitzavta Levadana. Vayomer Ki et Sheva Kavasot Tekach Miyadi, Bavur Tihi Li, Le'eda, Ki chafarti et haba'er hazot. Verse 31, Al kain kara lamakom hahu ba'er shava, ki sham nishba'u shenehem, vayikratu verit ba'er shava, or rather biv Shava. Vayakom Avimelech ufichol sar tzava'o vayashuvu el eretz Philishtim. Verse 33, Vayata eshel biv Shava vayikra sham b'shem Adonai el olam. Vayagor Avraham ba'eretz Pelishtim yamim rabim. Okay, translating now, 28. Avraham, it's like he made stand, or he stood up, or he separated 7 ewe lambs of the sheep by themselves. And Avimelech said to Avraham, what are these? Or yeah, what are they? 7 ewe lambs, these 7 ewe lambs of sheep, doesn't use the word sheep, which you have separated out by themselves. And he said, because of the 7, because you will take 7 ewe lambs from my hand. I don't know. No, I would go back and do the key as just indeed, or some kind of emphatic particle. Indeed, you should take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand, so that you will be to me a witness that I dug, chafarti, I dug this well. Now, verse 31, therefore, Al-Kain, he called that place Be'er Sheva, or Be'er Sheva, Be'er Sheva, because there the two of them swore, and they made a covenant, or they cut a covenant at Be'er Sheva. And Avimelech got up, and Pichol is the captain of his army, and they returned to the land of the Philistines. And he planted, now we're talking about Avraham, he planted a tamarisk tree at Beersheba, and he called there on the name of Yahweh, of the name of the Lord, El Olam, God forever. I think it's a proper name there, El Olam. And Avraham sojourned in the land of the Philistines many days. Okay, well, we have just a couple of minutes, but what questions or observations do you have?
This isn't really grammatical, but do you think the name, the Beersheba, has to do with, there's a link with the 7 animals?
Yeah, for sure. This is we call like an There's a lot of etiology in the Genesis narratives. That's certainly one of them. This is kind of a story for the place of Beersheba, which is the southernmost place in Judah as far as city goes. And Avraham is associated with this. So we've had sort of a well story at the beginning of 21. And now we have the Sheva. It's kind of it could be the 7, but it's also the root for to swear, Shavat, which may be more in the background, like the well of the oath. So I'd probably say that's more there, but it could be, I'm not surprised that the number is 7, right, Sheva. If you go to Israel, you can visit Beersheba, and it's one of the oldest kind of excavated cities in that area. Well, it's right in the border of the Negev. So when Abraham, when we get to like Jacob, we're going to be up in the north. He hangs out in the north, but Abraham's always in the south at Hebron or Beersheba. And then we get the stuff about the land of the Philistines at the end, which Avimelech is sort of like borderlands here, where Philistines would have been to the west and a little bit to the north. And that's a bit anachronistic as well. The Philistines, that are associated with the sea peoples, don't enter into, they come from the Mycenaean Greek area to the coast of the Mediterranean around the same time as the Exodus, Israel entering into the land. So for readers, the land of the Philistines makes sense because they're reading this in a time after the Philistines were there. But for Avraham, he wouldn't have thought of that as the land of the Philistines.
Something about the 7 and oath I think is interesting is I spoke to you one time, I don't remember exactly, but you talked about reading in the original language is like watching TV in full color instead of black and white kind of a thing. And I think this is a good example of that, where it could be the 7 sheep, or it could be the swearing of an oath. And with the Hebrew, you see the wordplay, but in English, it's totally, it doesn't, 7 and oath don't sound anything like, right? They're unrelated words in English, but they're very similar in the original language. And I think that's kind of a neat aspect of that. But one thing I had heard, a tamarisk tree is a cultivated tree. And it's not the kind of a tree that you would plant and just leave, but it's also a slow growing tree. And it's one that you would plant that is more like for your grandchildren. Just kind of an interesting element. I think if it's the right tree, it's a salt cedar, and they carry a lot of moisture in their leaves. And so literally the shade of a tamarisk tree is cooler than the shade of other trees.
Okay, good.
So it's kind of an interesting possibility that if he plants this tree that's like sit in its shade for generations to follow. It's kind of an interesting idea.
Interesting. It brings up this other thing, and this maybe I know we're coming to an end here, but Abraham's always by trees. So I think back in chapter 18, he's hanging out by the oaks. And here he's got a tamarisk tree, and he's also having encounters with God by trees. So that happens in chapter 18. And on the one hand, he's just giving some rest under the shade. And perhaps there's a practical function here, but in this particular case, he's calling on the name of Yahweh, El Olam. We have this kind of naming of Yahweh's with a God with places, and trees are often planted in those places. And I don't think that necessarily Avraham was participating in kind of a foreign cult or anything like this, but it's just common at cult places to have trees be ritual symbols. And there may be something to that in these Avraham stories, kind of like meeting God in the mountain, planting a tree at a high place.
Do you think there's a relationship to the idea of the standing stones, where they'll set up a stone, like at Bethel, where it's, what's the deal with the stone? Why is that one standing up? Well, let me tell you the story that goes with it, kind of a thing. Yeah,
there's this kind of reminder, memorial aspect to it. There's also something more to it, potentially, where And someday we'll get into the Jacob stories and Hebrew story time. We could talk about that one. But in Deuteronomy, they're supposed to knock down all these stones and cut down all these trees. They're the Asherah trees, Asherah poles, and the standing stones, the mitzvot, are, in the Deuteronomistic reforms, they're getting rid of all these other cultic places. So there's more to come in that story, but in the Genesis narratives, yes, I do. It's a reminder, but it's also like in the Bethel story, it's a place where God dwells, even dwells within that stone. It's a big conversation along these lines with kind of how Israel participated or understood the presence of God with them. This is one of those verses, though, that hints at something along those lines. All right, well, I'm fine with hanging out if anybody wants to continue to hang out and talk, but this concludes Hebrew story time. Genesis 22 next week. I am excited about that story, obviously an important story, the binding of Isaac. And so please come back and tell your friends, bring your friends to Hebrew story time.
Can I ask something about I think you translated cut a covenant. I take it that's the literal.
A karat is to cut, yeah. The usually translated, it's an idiom. In Genesis 15, you have this story where Avraham is making a covenant with God, and they actually do cut animals. And there's another story in Jeremiah that kind of gets at this, so that there's some kind of origin perhaps in that phrase of actually splitting animals in two. It doesn't mean that every time you have cutting a covenant that there is that ceremony, but it just becomes kind of the idiomatic for making a covenant.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to pause the recording.